I'm Alan Wardis, and you're listening to Think Radio.
What combination of random events led to this kind of strange trajectory of time where you go from a seminary life to a hedonistic, exploratory, commune-oriented, anti-government?
That's Art Goodtimes, poet and former 5-time SanMiguel County Commissioner in Colorado. You won't want to miss this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by the Western State Colorado University Office of Academic Affairs. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio patron, visit alanwardesmedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Art, thanks for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Alan.
Well, you and I have sat around a lot in our association talking about your story, and I think it's such an interesting story. Let's go all the way back.
Oh, dear.
Well, not
my
all
earliest
the way
memory.
back.
Want my earliest memory? This is always fun because I just was reading somewhere how eating the snot from your babies, doing that actually helps them increase their gut bacteria. So my earliest memory is picking up a piece of dried snot and eating it. That's the earliest thing.
Okay, there you have it. Eating your boogers is good for you. All right, well, we don't really have anything else to say after that.
You wanted to go deep, Alan, so there we go. There's a great start.
Well, let's pick the story up. I guess 1967 would be a good year. Summer of love.
Oh.
A lot of people traveled from around the country to get to the Haight-Ashbury.
Yeah.
But you were already there.
No, actually, I traveled that same summer and came back to San Francisco, having been born there, raised down the peninsula, went off to a seminary, went to an Indian reservation, and then came back the summer of love to San Francisco in the hippie era. And I was a newly freed seminarian experiencing adolescence at 21. It was great fun.
Yeah. Well, one could say a unique formative experience for sure. I mean, a lot of people say, yeah, I was there in the 60s, but you were there.
It was interesting to have been born. Astrology is a very strange science. It seems more like an art, and it sometimes is helpful, but you wonder sometimes what combination of random events led to this kind of strange trajectory of time where you go from a seminary life to a hedonistic, exploratory, commune-oriented, anti-government, opposed to the Vietnam War, civil rights strong, Black Panther support, American Indian. It was an incredible efflorescence of American let a thousand flowers bloom. We sort of exploded with all new ideas and new energies. And so the 60s were very much a time when the kids of wealthiest time in American history, the 50s, they had no worries except to experiment. And the pill had just come and it changed sexual energies. And so it was an amazing time. People were trying all kinds of crazy things and then saying yes or no. Or, it was actually a wonderful experience for me at that point in my life where I could absorb it all. Some people had already kind of jumped into the 60s from a set place. Me, I was totally open. So the summer of love, coming back to San Francisco, going to the Human Bee Inn to see General Wastemore land with his rocket helmet. It was a great time.
So do you see now, at this point, any similarities in the world between that rich, ripe moment of change and what is unfolding around us now? It's a different kind of change, perhaps, but what similarities do you see having lived through both of them?
We were coming out of affluence. The big issue with the Johnson War on poverty is how we were going to make everybody affluent. That was what my charge was as a VISTA volunteer, in service to America, because I spent 2 years as a conscientious objector, but I also spent a voluntary year and a half as a VISTA, because I really believed in Kennedy's admonition to do what you can for the world, don't just expect everything. I was really motivated by that energy, and so for me, this whole 60s was a powerful element of positive change, whereas for a lot of people it was a dead end or a craziness, and it certainly challenged the authorities. It's so different from today when we come not out of affluence, we come out of this downturn, depression. For a lot of people it was losing your home, and now cataclysm on top of it, a lot of people losing their home, a lot of people really hurt and upset, and then a lot of people very comfortable. So it's like America has always been. It's full of contradictions, and so I'm hopeful. This time reminds me closer to Nixon's time and how helpless it felt when Nixon got reelected, only shortly to resign because of Watergate. But he got reelected in spite of what was obviously lying and crookery. And now we're seeing the same kind of thing. So my hope is that the young people will realize how off-kilter this whole system is right now and bring us back forward and into a better, rational future.
And so in the 60s, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, there were some exceptions, but that wasn't a time or a movement with a lot of elder leadership. And yet here you are. First of all, did you ever think you'd be an elder?
One never knows.
Yeah, but here you are in a position of elder wisdom. You're 71 now? 72. Time flies. But you're in a position of elder wisdom. Well, I'm going to phrase this as two questions.
Okay.
First of all, if you could transport back in time and speak to your assembled self and friends in 1967, what advice would you give yourself now that you're an elder? And what would you say to today's youth?
Let's start with today's youth first, because there's a poem by a Northwest Coast poet, Robert Sund. We call that Ish Nation because there's so many Ish rivers, Duwamish, Skokomish, all those Ish river country. And Robert Sund was one of the premier poets. It's a very short piece. It goes, "In every good dance, there's a step backwards, too." And so for me, I think what I see is the youth getting energized, realizing that we can use wind and solar and evaporation. I'm hearing now they're using evaporation as a new energy source. And there's all these things that are positive energy that's moving forward. And then we have the entrenched interests that have a hard time moving. And so for politics, we need to be in that middle place. And that's hard for our youth. They want to go in the outside and be on either side, industry side or, environment side or whatever side you want to choose. But really the work gets done in the middle, and it's getting those big behemoths to move in the direction that the society needs to go. And that can happen. It's more cumbersome, takes a longer time, and people feel when they're young that everything is happening fast. Your first question was what there, Alan?
What advice would you have for yourself if you could travel through
time? The only thing I would I had a great time. I don't think I'd change a lot. There were some behaviors that were probably not very mature that might have been nice to not have happened, but they happened. Mostly I'd want to go into botany, I think. I really am fascinated by plants, and I really would have loved to have studied botany and known more about it rather than English, which I learned a lot. My English teacher, when I went in for postgrad to try to see if I wanted to go on studying poetry, he said, if you want to write poetry, go overseas for 2 years. He didn't say to read a book. He just said, get away from things.
He said, go live some.
Go live some. Too many people write without much to talk about. And so sometimes, for some of us who've gone through these twisted trajectories of time and arcs, I think we need more time. So elderhood has been a nice place to kind of reflect on some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, you brought up poetry, which has been a big part of your life all along the way, but really had its roots also in Haight-Ashbury, right? Being around those beat poets, the people who were using language to really try to address and describe that rich moment.
I grew up in the San Francisco Chronicle in the 50s and the 60s and even into the 70s. And so I had these incredible columnists. There were these incredible people who I followed pretty religiously. Herb Cain, Art Delaplane, Hugh McCabe. There were these great people writing in all these different styles about all these different things. And I was fascinated with that. So it really got me going in language. But it was when I went into seminary and I started writing letters home and I got bored, so I started putting them into verse, that I began to think about poetry as a way to play around with language. And then reading Gerard Manley Hopkins, well, that put me over the edge.
Mm-hmm, it would. And you were rubbing elbows with some pretty famous names and some pretty great poetic thinkers. What was that like?
It's interesting. Some of those icons are not as approachable or as considerate. Gary Snyder, I always really appreciated a lot, and I really loved his energy, and I've got to see him a couple times. He's really an interesting and a wonderful man. A strong Buddhist. He's got his own very private life that he leads, and he's a marvelous writer, I think one of the best of our generation. But yeah, I have met a lot of people. Some of them have been great disappointments, some of them have been mild disappointments, and some of them have been sort of neutral.
Yeah. There was an energy to that beat poetry, though, that has followed you through your literary life.
Well, when I used to first read in San Francisco with my long hair and beard, everybody said, "Oh, Allen Ginsberg." And that was funny because I had one exchange with Alan, who I really admire. I love some of his poems are really incredible. The Sunflower Sutra, and I really liked the poem about that long road in Lincoln, Nebraska. Oh, I always thought that was a powerful piece. But he himself was kind of an obnoxious character, and I remember going to a reading and reading this poem I had strong emotional attachment to, and having a last sort of flourished line, and him saying, piping up from the back of the crowd, "You don't need that last line." So my only interchange with Alan wasn't exactly a friendly one, but
Yeah.
he was a combative character, and I certainly admire him, like I do many of our American poets, many of whom I probably wouldn't have liked in person.
Well, before you take down any more of our icons, let's go ahead and move on. Because from all that activism that you listed off there early in your life, of all places, you wound up as a county commissioner in a rural, politically conservative region of
Region was
San Miguel
very
County.
conservative.
Yeah.
Everything
You
around us.
wound up in a place where no one would have predicted looking at you on the streets of Haight-Ashbury. How did that happen?
That's so funny because when I served in office, I served with two other friends of mine. One was a county commissioner in La Plata County, Wally White, who was a llama herder, breeder, and other things about which we can't talk about. Anyway, he had long hair and a ponytail. He, along with myself and over in San Juan County, the three of us were all long-haired guys with ponytails. So Governor Ritter used to call us the Ponytail Caucus, because when he'd come to Cub 20, the only people that would laugh at any of his jokes were us.
But you started off as a Democrat, right? But quickly moved to the Green Party.
Not really quickly. Well, I've been in Telluride almost 40 years now, and so most of that time I was a Democrat. It wasn't until 1998 when Ron Tupa changed the law in Colorado and gave Greens ballot access, and I'd been elected 2 years as a Dem when I changed parties. It happened to be at the same time that our president, who was a Democrat, had lied about something and hadn't resigned, which I thought was quite an insult. Our governor, Romer, didn't support the woman who was the Democratic nominee, and she lost narrowly to Owens, which I kind of blamed on Roy Romer, who was the Democratic national chair. He was widely appreciated by the public. He could have really helped win that one. And then in our local county Democrats, there was a black chair that was ousted by a faction that put up a convicted child felon as a member of the county committee to get rid of the black leader. So with those three things on the state, national, and local level, I was fed up with the Democrats.
Understood. But you could have declared as unaffiliated. Why the Green Party?
Well, I believed in the 10 key values. They're sort of like the 10 commandments. I like the European Greens. They have 4 pillars, but we have 10 commandments, key values, whatever you call them. And there's a whole litany of things. But basically, it's grassroots democracy, it's social justice, it's environmental wisdom, future focus, feminism. It's a lot of the things I believed in. So why not identify myself by who I am? And I'm definitely a Green when it comes to the Democrats or the Republicans.
Clearly. Back to the question, though. How did you wind up here?
So
Of
I
all
had a
places.
network of seminary friends all over the country, and 2 of them settled in Telluride. It was an up-and-coming town. They'd moved to San Francisco to Denver, Denver to the up-and-coming ski area that wasn't quite there yet, Telluride. I went to visit and was enamored and fell in love and stayed.
You wanted to tell me that story about driving along in the car?
Oh, yeah. I was just driving over this week over here to Gunny from Norwood, a couple drainages over. I was thinking about the time I'd stopped back in the 70s with one of those drive-away cars. You know, they used to give you a car and say, drive it to this place within a certain amount of time, and you get it free. You pay the gas, but you get a free ride. So I had one of those cars. And unfortunately, it was one that Ralph Nader made fun of so much, the Pinto. And I had this Pinto that had a battery that was overheating. It wasn't a radiator, it was a battery. So every time you opened the hood, it was spitting acid all over the place. You had to walk in with a shield, and the acid would eat through your shield. It was quite the experience. But I remember being on Cerro Gordo and saying, well, I love this country. I wish I could live somewhere off of this highway. And now, 50 years later, that's just what I've gone and done.
You sure did. Well, and these days, one of the big problems or issues, facts of life that people in Colorado have to face is that there are a lot of people driving through Colorado, stepping out of the car and saying, wow, I wish I could live here.
Yeah.
As a county commissioner, you probably dealt with some of that. What do you think about Colorado's transition into what is projected to be pretty serious population growth over the next 2 decades?
So again, my teacher, Dolores LaChapelle, would always talk about the elephant in the room, and that's population. In my lifetime, Alan, 170-plus year lifetime, we have gone from 3 billion to 7.5 billion people. There's nothing sustainable about something like that. That's in one lifetime. We are a population out of control. So whether it's Colorado or New Mexico or California or anywhere on the planet, we're going to have the same thing happening until we, as a species, get control of our population. Now, that control is so scary because we've all been raised on free choice. I certainly have. And I love all the choices we have in this country. So how to balance free choice for the individual and a necessary rethinking of resource allocation and equality for all, that's a big conversation that there's no simple answer for.
There are no simple answers, but let's talk about a couple of the complicated ones, because that's a big issue in the Gunnison Valley right now.
Yeah.
The buzz phrase is sustainable tourism. Sustainable I suppose, in the broadest spectrum meaning of that word, meaning it doesn't degrade the resource, it doesn't negatively impact the community. You spent 20 years as a county commissioner wrestling with issues just like that. Any nuggets of wisdom you want to throw our way as we wrestle with this issue?
Well, it's not something that the politics is going to change. It's not going to be your political systems. The county government that I represented, which was an elected position in which I didn't get to have my own views. I am a Green, but I didn't vote Green. I voted like the people wanted, and I paid close attention through various sources to try to understand what the majority of people in my county wanted on issues. And when I felt comfortable, I would make some decisions, but sometimes I got called up short. So it wasn't a place where I could put into practice what I believed from Dolores LaChapelle and deep ecology and bioregionalism and all these kind of movements that I've been part of throughout my life. That's not the way that politics works. It's a slow, reactive, takes a big push by people. So to get people to push, you need sort of stimulus. And so I guess as cultural workers, I always felt that it was important to try and educate people about stuff and bring things to people, which is why I ended up working for the ThinkRadio Institute after politics and working on Ute reconciliation, working on a Fen advisory committee for these incredible Fen project we have going in SanMiguel County, working on poetry, working on mushrooms, working on all the things that I love that I don't get paid for, but that I really think are important for the world.
Well, we're going to come back to some of those things. But first, I want to talk about Dolores. You've mentioned her a couple of times, Dolores LaChapelle. Tell us about her, who she is, and why she's had such a large influence on your life.
Well, I remember going to a conference in San Francisco back in the 80s, and it was a left-right conference, and the right was WRITE. And so it was a room, half of them Marxist-Leninists, talking about class structure and how we had to change the relationships of our classes. And half the room was personal liberationists, gays and lesbians and transgender folks. And they're all saying, oh, the classes doesn't matter if you're treating people badly intimately, so wait a minute here. And then there's a few of us at the back of the room who are saying, where does the earth fit in all of this? And so Dolores, when I met her through Earth First, a network I was connected with, I was their poetry editor for 10 years in their journal. I really found someone who gave us a philosophy that understood the value of relationships, not just objects, but relationships. It's not the good, bad, like The Hobbit tells us. That's a Christian kind of myth. What we're really talking about is a much more complex, as some of the Puebloan people say, it's walking, the beauty way is like walking around a circle between light and dark. You're always moving back and forth between them. And that's kind of how it is for me. I'm always kind of diving into things and pulling back out and learning. So as long as I can keep doing that and I have that freedom, but at the same time, maybe we need more restrictions. Somehow we need some way, some ritual, some religious belief that in order to conserve the resources for our species, we need to kind of change the way we think about parenting.
Wow, you've come full circle to parenting. But let me ask again about Dolores, because if I understand, one of her takeaway points is that there's really no hope.
No. That's what she said. She's hopeless. It was one of her favorite phrases when you try to say, well, what if we did this and did this and did this? Would this make this better? And she would say, it's hopeless. Rationally, it doesn't seem like there's any way out of this mess. We seem to be headed on a destructive path that's going to impact our species. It may take some other species with us, but mostly it's going to hurt us more than anything else. So why we're on this death spiral path through our culture and where it's leading in these dystopian futures that our science fiction people spin out before us, which we maybe ought to read if we want to know what's going to happen. When you get to all those things, she was really full of hope. She always felt like miracles happen. You can't explain what happens. We have to work towards hope because hope is all we have. If we want to be mean to each other, we can certainly be sarcastic and cruel and ironic, but honestly, nobody has an answer. We have lots of questions. We always bring up the answers we think we know, and we learn through our lives. But in the end, we don't really know much either. It's all kind of a mystery. So as my friend Jack Mueller, who just passed away, Budada would say, all power to the paradox.
Jack was one of those beat poets that I referred to that you met.
He was a post-beat. Yeah, you could call him a beat poet. So it's funny. So I grew up in San Francisco, and I remember the North Beach beatniks, who were peaceniks, who were beat. And beats were people who kind of rejected society, lived in the margins, did a lot of alcohol and drugs, were totally selfish and hopeless and obnoxious characters, but they were living a dream. And so that became a cult. There's a lot of people who looked to the beats as though it was something that was admirable, and I wouldn't say that. I'd say it was a almost dysfunctional lifestyle, urban lifestyle, that was combative, very ideological, very elitist in its odd kind of reverse way. So as a person who was part of Poetry for the People and worked with Kush and Cloud House and all these movements in San Francisco that were trying to open poetry up to the wider classes, these guys were like these North Beach kind of guys that were so cool you couldn't talk to them.
And Jack was about Poetry for the People.
Jack was the bridge. He was the only one of that circle that I remember, although I've been catching up with Neely Cherkovsky lately. But mostly Jack was the person who was willing to reach out. He started this union of street poets where we all would take our poets, mimeograph them, I think at the time, maybe Xerox, and then put them up in laundromats and on buses and all over the city. And it was just a way to bring poetry into the life of the city.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper. Think Radio is also supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can join the Think Radio community of patrons, visit alanwartismedia.com. That's ALANWARTES media.com.
Let's go back and pick up something about your background. You have a degree in early childhood education.
I have a lifetime teaching credential from California.
So talk to me, what is it now in your elder years about parenting that you'd like to see change?
Well, I grew up with the idea that I wanted 12 or 15 kids. I was a good Catholic boy, and it seemed like a big family, big enough to make a football team or a baseball team would be perfect. And so I liked having brothers and sisters. I thought that was cool. But it was more intellectual, the way I was raised, too. I had two brothers, and we fought a lot, but we were friends, too, so I would have liked a lot more. How do we change that image of having a lot of children and to make us human into something it's a real privilege to be able to raise a child, and I want to have the setup ready to go. I want to do a diet before I conceive so that I make sure that I'm passing along the best genes that I have. There's lots of ways that we can intelligently try to parent our children and try to limit ourselves. I had 3 blood children, so I'm not a good person to talk about this in some ways because I haven't lived it because accidents happen, and they're happy accidents. I'm so happy, but they weren't planned, yeah.
All right, politics. Let's talk about the state of democracy today.
One of the things I'm going to go talk in Denver. Every year I go to the Center of the American West. Patricia Limerick, the state historian, has me come to a class and talk about politics. As a rural county commissioner, ex-liberal in a very conservative area, but who actually ended up being very middle of the road and somebody that could work with all sides. To me, the middle way is really the way that society works best. It doesn't work best. If you're in the process, if you're in the politics, it's better to be in the middle. If you're outside of politics, you really don't want to be in the middle. You want to be way out of the fringe. So the levers of power that occur in the political world and outside are very different in my mind. Now, they may cross over with some individuals, but in my experience that the more ideological people are is less important than how willing they are to collaborate. So I almost want to have a party of the radical middle. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or a constitutionalist. Doesn't matter. What I want is somebody who comes from where they are, what they believe, and wants to work together with other people to make something happen. So we're going to be working in the middle, a party of the radical middle. That's what I would like to see. So for me, I don't know if we'll get there, but maybe a coalition of some kind that would actually work to try to bring us to the middle. Nobody's going to get all the things they want. Society and politics doesn't work that way. But we ought to try to do as much as we can. Maybe we ought to rethink paying for abortions as a public need. As much as I will contribute and would personally pay because I believe in free choice, I think we have to start to really look at our shibboleths and try to figure out how can we work with other people to satisfy a bit of their agenda. And because, we all live on this planet. We all are the planet. That's the whole Gregory Bateson, Dolores LaChapelle image, is that we aren't separate from nature. We are nature. This microphone is natural. It's organic. This aluminum around that door is organic. It's organic chemistry. We're all part of this world, and all of our pieces stay in this world, according to the way we understand our physics. So we're all part of this world, even though we may not own much of it. I've been talking to people. I write a column. I've been doing it for like 35, 40 years now, a weekly column, and I've been talking about the inner Trump. And I think people don't realize that we have that bully inside of us. It's part of our makeup as Americans. It just is. Whether it's Teddy Roosevelt, who was a bully boy, or, that kind of push people around Texas attitude that some people like to kind of take on. It's part of us. So we all ought to recognize it and then try to sublimate it or caution it or strap it down to a gurney table and wheel it out for delivery.
Well, if you look at Fox News, CNN, NBC, the list goes on. Is there any evidence in your mind that we might be understanding something about the radical middle? Or do you think right now we're in a part of the trajectory that's just pulling us apart?
Well, I think when you're the empire, when you are the ruling force in the world, as we are, when someone gets elected not just to the head of the country, but to the head of the entire world, that's what we have now, is we have an emperor who really runs the world, because America is one of the balanced safeguards, not the only one, but one of the balanced safeguards that keeps the world from blowing up. So it's a very complex and strange place that we're in now. In Chinese society, when you go back in history, and I love history, it wasn't the revolutionaries who were the heroes of Chinese society. The heroes, if you read the Three Kingdoms in some of their texts, the heroes were the people that held empire together. Because when empire blows apart, all hell breaks loose. So some of the people who had the greatest desire for good were people who tried to hold things together. So for me, the middle is that hopeless place where you're trying to hold some things together. And I'd love to see more people occupy that place. If you look in the local level, oftentimes that's happening. So I think it's one of those games where it's not on the national, it's usually not on the state, but it's often on the local that you'll find people working together to help each other. Who was it just the other day? They were saying how a tree blew down on their house. And before they knew it, people were over there with chainsaws. People they didn't know, whose political views were completely separate, were out there chainsawing, cutting up, and by the afternoon, they were free and their house was fine. It's that kind of local helping each other that is also part of the Western ethic of the individual that I think is why so many of us love living here. And I think on that level, politics does work.
So maybe the trick is to not watch Fox News or CNN, because that's not a local perspective at all, but to focus more entirely on what's happening in your backyard. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. It's an addiction we have to the instantaneous news. It's another kind of addiction, like meth or cocaine or cannabis for some. I like cannabis personally as an inspirational drug, but not everybody uses it the same as I do. But I think it's a hard thing for people to grasp, and it's going to take a bit of education. I think that's what Dolores was really about, was trying to educate people about the local and about the national, about turning off the news that doesn't make any sense and letting in some of the news that does. I really like the Gunnison Country Times here in Gunnison. You guys have a fine newspaper compared to the terrible newspaper in my county, which doesn't do a very good job, which only hires fresh out of college students who they pay very little so they can live in a ski town. It's this whole game of using a newspaper as a cash cow rather than as a community organ. And you guys have competition with the Crested Butte paper, so it's kind of a lively scene, whereas it's not all communities are like that. I think the local level is very exciting to be totally immersed in that. Then I read the news. It's called The Week. It's like a Time or a Newsweek, but it's actually a very nice, balanced. It shows conservative views and liberal views, and it shows the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. So it gives you different kinds of sides of things for national, and then some international news as well.
So you mentioned things that you're up to in your retirement. Talk to us about a couple of those.
I helped start a Fen group. Now, I didn't know what a Fen was when I started up in Telluride, but because the San Juan Mountains around Telluride there, the Wilsons, were this giant slip-slide avalanche feature. So it's one of the biggest avalanche movement areas, I think, in the country. And it's got these sort of platforms where it slides and then levels out, slides and levels out. So it's slope, level, all the way, kind of stair-stepped up the mountain, which was why it made a nice ski area. But in a couple, there's about 5 places. What were at one time glacial tarns, lakes, filled up with these marsh plants and bog plants. But bogs are fed by underground. This is fed by the summer monsoons that come in August. And they get snow melt a lot of the year, but they get the monsoons. And they're like some of the oldest fens in the country. Fens are these peatlands that are fed from above. And so they're like 10,000 years old. They were at the very southern edge of the glaciation of the North America. And they're like repositories of all this information. Pollen from the last 10,000 years, which can give it climate change information. There's all kinds of stuff that's buried in here, different plant compositions. And each of these 5 fens are different. So I helped start as a commissioner a study, complicated long story, but the bottom line was we started a study with Dr. David Cooper out of CSU. And we've done that study for like 15 years, and now we're reviving it again. And it's the oldest longitudinal study of fens anywhere in the country. So that's one project that I've been working on.
So here you are now in your elderhood, back to botany.
That's exactly right. I'm trying to tie up these loose ends. You know, I was a Vista volunteer on the Crow Indian Reservation in Montana. So I learned a lot about Native people, went back home and read a lot, became an American Indian movement supporter. I went to the pipe ceremonies for boat longest walks in the 70s and 80s. Coming to D.C. from San Francisco, actually took food out to one. And then in 1980, I went to the survival gathering that the American Indian movement held in South Dakota. It was a very powerful movement with people from 33 different countries there. John Turdell was one of the speakers, one of the most amazing speeches I've ever heard about power belonging not to the guns, not to the government, power belonging to the people.
Well, which brings us to one of the last things you did as a commissioner before your retirement, involving the Ute Nation. Tell us about that.
Well, you know, each place I've been, when I came back to California after living in Montana and learning a little bit about Native culture and Native American issues, I then studied what happened in California. The Mendocino War of 1873, it's something nobody's even heard of. I mean, there were all these terrible incidents and terrible things that happened. And so it was a real wake-up call for me to understand. And then I realized I'm not an Indian. I'm a Euro-American, mostly Italian. But nevertheless, I still felt a tribal connection to people living here and got pushed out for no reason of their own, really. And so when I came to Colorado, I did a lot of history research and found out about the Ute people and how they were swindled out of the land that actually I live on, that Gunnison actually was their homeland, particularly the Uncompahgre Band. And so the fact that we were able to have this event in Salida last weekend, the Chipeta Rising celebration, that was incredibly powerful because Chipeta and her ancestors and a couple of the council members that are both Uncompahgre Ute representatives to the United Ute Tribe in Utah, which composed of 3 bands, the 2 Uncompahgre leaders both came to this event. And they really appreciate being back in their homeland because this Gunnison and the Salida area were really where this was their home. This is where they lived and this is where they hunted. And so it was really powerful to hear them speak about that. And in SanMiguel County, we have had a long history of doing things. We started back in 1998 when I first got on the board. We were celebrating Columbus Day at that time, and I found offense with that. I thought it was inappropriate. I had come from the Bay Area where Berkeley had declared Indigenous Peoples Day in 1992, and the Berkeley City Council. And so I asked the other commissioners and got them to go along with changing the name to Indigenous Peoples Day for the county back in 1999 or 98. I can't remember exactly now. So one of the earlier government agencies to do what Salt Lake City just did last week, what Farmington did 2 weeks ago, which is happening around the country in different places. We in SanMiguel County made an apology after much research and after much work with elders like Roland McCook in Montrose. We made a formal apology, government to government, from San Miguel County to the Uncompahgre Utes, who were moved out of the land that is now San Miguel County by the cavalry against their will. Even though they agreed to move to Grand Junction, at the last minute they did a little bait and switch and moved them to Utah instead. So the Uncompahgre people were moved out of Colorado completely. So we made that resolution at the reservation of Fort Duchesne, and then it got accepted. And now we've been doing cultural exchange programs to try and continue that process of reconciliation.
Reconciliation is a big word when you're talking about such a deep history. What comes next past a formal apology? Is there a next step in the works?
So when I went to this 200th anniversary of the Land Office, which then became the BLM, a federal agency, to the Center of the American West, again, Patricia Limerick invited me to be one of the participants, and I really relished the opportunity. And when the first speaker that she had was Walter Echohawk. And the first thing he told us at this anniversary of this organization that gave away land to all these immigrants, first thing he said is, all of the land that was here when you European Americans came here was owned. And he went on to talk about, until America has some reconciliation with its native peoples, the nation is never going to be at peace. And I took that very seriously because I feel like we've had nothing but endless wars as the policemen of the world. From Korea on, we've been fighting all these battles, little battles, not quite wars, but actions or whatever they're calling them. But they're wars, they're fights. There are people getting killed, our people and other people. It's not peace. It's something completely separate from peace.
Well, the question that I asked was, you made an apology, San Miguel County.
It was accepted. So reconciliation has 5 parts. This is the way Walter explained it when I asked him after. He said, first part is there's an incident, something happens. Then there's an apology by the perpetrator. There is an acceptance by the victim or their descendants. And then there's reparations, restitution, and then there's reconciliation. So it's a 5-step process. So the fact that we had not made an apology in 136 years, that bothered me. I thought that was inappropriate. So we, as a small entity, for the area that we were responsible for, made a small apology to this tribe as a precedent so people would pay attention and say, we all ought to be making this apology. The state ought to be making this apology. We ought to get the apology accepted, and then we can work on what comes next. I don't know exactly what comes next. I don't think anybody does. This is all something we're inventing ourselves.
No time like now to start.
It's what gives me hope, is doing these things that seem hopeless.
So, Art, you've retired. I have a feeling if we followed you around with a camera, we wouldn't see anything that a normal person would recognize as retirement. Thank you for your years of service.
Thank you, Alan.
And thanks for joining us on Think Radio.
A great pleasure.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison, Colorado's locally owned hometown newspaper.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wardis Media. The show's associate producer is Kat Seibert. Music by Issa Forrest. You've been listening to Think Radio on KWSB FM 91.1 in Gunnison, Colorado, from the campus of Western State Colorado University. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Think Radio.